Hello and welcome. My name is Jacopan and I'm here to provide some resources for QAT modding. And today we're going to be going over tech. Tech is a pretty varied topic. There's a lot of different ways you could define it. There's not really that much consensus on what actually is tech, but for the most part, to me, tech is just something where you have to think about how to play it. If it's not something you're used to, then I'd consider it tech. It could even be just straight up down, and if it's something difficult like the tinnitus brain melters or brain specialist, then yeah, it could be techie. So we're going to be going through today on how you, the QAT modder, or just you, a mapper trying to improve your work, can go about effectively communicating and analyzing a tech map to try to make it better. There's a lot of topics to this. Tech is a very difficult thing to cover. There's not that many set rules, and there's a lot of ways to break these rules. In fact, you could probably break almost all of these rules if you find enough justification and are careful enough about how to use it. But I mean, generally, these rules will help you improve a map and get it to the best point that it can be. So, with all that in mind, the first thing that you want to think about with tech, especially as the QAT modder, is emphasis and contrast. So when it comes to tech, it really is about how much something stands out. So this is one of those things that I'll say Cooling Closet is exceptionally good at, is their maps are often very, very particular and controlled with what things are challenging and what things are comfortable. This lets the more interesting stuff, the challenging stuff, the techie stuff, stand out. And it lets the calmer part of the songs be more of a recovery and a rest. What this lets you do is you create this really cohesive package where it lines up with the song exceptionally well. You have this contrast, this emphasis, the difficulty of what's going on, feels very connected to the song, and the more energy and effort you put into playing will be connected to the music. And that's ultimately the goal, and that's ultimately the sign of high quality, is when you have a map that feels like you are playing the song. This is done through a variety of ways, not just emphasis and contrast, but connecting the song to the map is the ultimate goal for anything in this game in general, but especially for tech, because it's very easy to get lost in this by having stuff go too far into the different techie ranges when it really doesn't need to be, and as a result, you start losing it. And it just becomes a constant barrage of angles and oddities instead of something more connected. Now, some songs are very chaotic. Stuff like breakcore or the more aggressive Camellia rhythm core, they can be so consistently aggressive that it really does make sense for stuff to be very aggressive for the most of it. But in general, that's where emphasis and contrast is usually like the most important thing to be thinking about. So here we've got the sauce. This isn't a perfect map, and really there aren't any perfect maps, but I think it's an all right example of how contrast could be shown. So in this song, you've got quiet sections and you've got aggressive sections. Here we've got this quiet intro. Patterns are not trivial, but they're relatively slow. It's 180 BPM, which is on the higher side for tech, but the sharp angle here for the full BPM is 90 degree, and when it's slower, you've got a 135. But as soon as the song picks up, the angles pick up with it, and it starts getting more intense. And more importantly, what I'm trying to do here, and what I'm looking for if I was QAT bonding this, would be looking and seeing, do the aggressive sounds line up with the aggressive angles? Does stuff feel like it gets more difficult as the song gets more difficult? Here we've got this high emphasis hit, do a high emphasis sound. And this definitely isn't perfect. Some of these hits definitely could be reduced in intensity because the song is less intense. Drums pick up and now stuff gets more intense, both through the density of the notes as well as, again, through angles. You have a lot of different ways to control difficulty in tech, since you've got basically the entire spectrum of the mapping range, whereas in speed you're more limited to very comfortable and easy to read and transition angles because of how fast you're playing. But here in the techie world, you got so much room to be getting complicated with these things, and as a result, you can really explore every single means of emphasis. So it's calm, patterns are simple as a result. Picks back up, stuff gets more intense. It's building, so stuff gets more intense, and then as it tapers off in the angles as well. You're trying to connect it to the song here. There's a lot of ways to do that. Energy picks up, speed picks up in the notes. Angles aren't getting too much more complicated because, and I'll get to this later, you want to push difficulty very deliberately. You don't want to push difficulty in too many ways. But here we've got a calm section after all of that, and again, we're bringing the energy down to simple hits. You just want it to match. So that's the emphasis and the contrast. I think it's honestly the most important part of text, just having stuff stand out the right amount. You want to be thinking, are these things justifying the high energy? Are these angles reasonable to play at this BPM? Oftentimes, if something is just a little bit unreasonable, but it's the highest emphasis sound, it might be justifiable. Okay, so next step past that is now to look at the mapper's intent. So what did the mapper actually want to do with this? This can be very difficult, and it takes some empathy and thinking about what the mapper was trying to do. Sometimes it's very clear, sometimes it's not so clear. Here, this is all about these big angle transitions, these large hits with the stacks, and the big shifts in position and angle at the same time going into them. That is the main part of these transitions and sort of the intent / gimmick of what's going on here. You can see that there's very few diagonal angles too, and that's another thing that you would see in intent. If you were to QAT mod this, and in this section you were suggesting somebody put diagonals in here to soften angles, you might not see that happen because, well, you don't see any diagonals in that section until the shift in the rhythms to something new. So that's where you want to be following the intent of the mapper. Think about what consistent trends you're seeing, decide if they are connected to the music, and if so, what suggestions you want to be making and what optimizations you want to be thinking about want to fit in to that intent that the mapper has. If you're suggesting something that the mapper wasn't trying to do there, you're going to have less success. If you have a big heavy slider section and you're suggesting removing sliders, you might not get success. If you have a heavy angle shifting thing and you're suggesting just nerf it down to simple stuff, it's going to be less successful. Now, depending on who you're talking to, they might just fold anyway with your suggestions. If they are, I don't know, intimidated might not be the best word to say it, but, you know, if they are less confident in their own content, then they may fold to your suggestions early, and it is kind of your responsibility as a QAT member to not walk over people. Let people be proud of their work and not try to insist on forcing out their ideas for your own. You want to help them see the best version of their map. You don't want to impose your own vision on it instead. There's a couple other examples of intent, like here we've got this repeating pattern. If you were to suggest optimizations to it, typically you'd be suggesting optimizations that are preserving motions but making them easier to play, like this. So you want to be preserving the motion, but you still want it to be easier, so perhaps these diagonals could be a way to simplify the motion. It's not guaranteed that they will follow your advice, but it's a suggestion you could make. Okay, so the next thing that I want to cover here, and this ties into intent, is to think about structure. So structure is the idea of having a repeated concept that you listen, hear, and think about. Structure is something that you can grab onto and identify. It is basically a translation of what the map and the song connect to. So if you hear a sound, the translation of what that sound means in terms of what you actually play, that is the structure. That is the translation. That is the consistency. All of these words are similar ways of saying the same thing. Songs, if they connect to the music, will have this translation of music means something and it means another thing when you play it. That translation should be consistent. So here in this map, these builds have these 90-degree angle things going on. Just in general, this sort of wrist-heavy motion where you were scooping into each of these swings, this is consistent across multiple builds. Let's see if I can find... Yeah. Here we've got another build section. It's got this similar thing going on where it's these wrist rolling angles into stuff. That is structure. You hear this build, it has this connection, you can repeat it and identify this. The mapper wanted this to be the case. Any suggestions that you were making for optimizing or helping this should be based around keeping this idea. So let's say originally it was looking something like this, where these down notes were not crossed over. And as a result, this scoop is a lot sharper. Your optimization suggestion, instead of just asking for these to be made diagonal, which reduces the mapper's intent and probably won't get you on their side, would be instead to suggest to cross over these bottom notes, which gives you enough room for this scooping. It lets you preserve the mapper's intent and get their ideas in the best form it can be, rather than trying to nerf their ideas down to what you wish it would be. Structure shows up in a lot of places. Not all maps are going to be structured just by the nature of the song. Generally, a song needs to have very repeated stuff in order for it to be structured. If you're not seeing the same sounds or similar rhythms, then you're not going to be able to repeat stuff as well. Here we've got these flicks which rise, mirroring it onto the other hand. It's that structure. You see it, you repeat it, you feel it. Structure isn't always going to show up, but generally a mapper worth their salt or worth their weight is they're going to be thinking about structure and trying to come up with these ideas, and you should hopefully be able to identify them. And if honestly, if there's a lack of them, that is something that you could call out. You could say, hey, this doesn't feel structured enough. This song is very structured, but the mapping feels very random. I feel like you should be connecting this stuff a little bit more. Next thing I want to cover, it's again an extension of all of this, but it's a little bit different, is expectations. Generally with tech, you need to let the player know this is a tech map. You need to get the player into the mindset of, hey, I'm going to be playing tech. Hey, I need to be ready to hit some weird angles. Hey, I need to be ready to catch this stuff. There's a couple ways to do this. Honestly, if the song starts off aggressive, you may just be starting off with aggressive angles. If it's calmer, maybe you're doing simpler angles that are still just a little bit not normal so that you're used to it and ready to go. Here in this song, got this calm intro, but that's why we're doing all these wrist rolls in the intro. These heavy transitions at slower BPMs to let the player know, hey, this is a tech map. And even then, thinking past that, this is a tech map you can tell as soon as you get into these first angles. So that means your decisions as the mapper are based on your map being a package. It's being something that is played, consumed, thought about, and expecting it to be replayed if it's going to be ranked. People generally are not going to be able to sight read all sorts of craziness on their first try. You're generally going to be needing people to replay the more complicated stuff, especially if it's something that they're not used to. If it's conventional speed, there's only so many ways you can swing up down. If they know the rhythms to the song, or if the rhythms to the song are simple enough, then generally there's not really going to be that much for them to learn and need to repeat a map for, which is why tech maps often get a lot of frustration, is because they do need to be learned some more. people aren't used to being able to, or being asked to repeat something, try it over and over again to get it locked down and understood. Some of these transitions, like this scoop here from this red to this red, this is one that could catch you off guard. If you were not prepared for something like this, you'd be possibly swinging like this or maybe this, but people generally aren't always going to swing straight, or at least not swing true to every single angle, so this could often get bad cut because they're not expecting it. Does that mean it's something that needs to be fixed? Not really if it's 20 seconds into a song. This is another thing that comes in. The length of the song does matter. If you have something really unexpected and you are 4 minutes into a song, could be a problem. Because now they've got to replay the whole thing and go all the way through it before they get to the thing that they messed up and hope that it doesn't mess up again. This is just sort of a game design thing in general. You don't want stuff to be backloaded too hard. And honestly, front-loading difficulty is not a bad thing. Controlling the difficulty management over time, it doesn't mean that the end should be easy. It just should be managed. Well, think about this and just sort of comparing it to star numbers. Think about the map's difficulty over time. Say you're averaging this map as a 10-star map. Sorry, I hit my microphone there. Say you've got a 10-star difficulty average for the map. Breaks are like 3 stars in difficulty, and the drops are maybe like 10.5 stars in difficulty. If your first drop is 9 stars and your second drop is 11 stars, it's going to feel a little bit off. If you can control that and maybe make this 9.5 stars versus 10.5 stars, that's a little bit better. And honestly, this is a personal opinion, if that was more like 10.5 stars for the first one and then 9.5 or 10 stars for the second one, that's all right too. Because there's the pressure of being able to hold the combo and the precision to the second half for a more comfortable repeat, and just that pressure creates some of the intensity and difficulties. Like, you made it past the hard part, stay consistent, you know the rest. And I think that's fine. I think that could even be ideal in certain things. Generally, the more experimental you get, the less you want the frustrating stuff to be at the end of the song. You'd rather people be able to learn by restarting and getting right into it so they can learn something new. And this is honestly where short songs are really the best stuff for getting experimental. If you have a 2-minute experimental map, you got all the time in the world to restart and get back to it, because it's only going to take you 30 seconds to get there. If you got a 7-minute experimental map where you've got some really weird stuff people aren't used to 6.5 minutes in, guess what they got to do if they mess it up? They got to play 6.5 minutes to get back there. That's frustrating. That's a lot of lost time. And honestly, all that lost time is not spent learning the frustrating part. This is where your expectations come in too. You want to be thinking about, how do I let them know this is going to be weird right away so they can be ready for it and get themselves into the mindset of, okay, I got to learn stuff. Here, within the first 10 seconds, we've got 90-degree angles and wild-ass stack double combinations with notes pointing into each other. People haven't seen this. People are going to be surprised by it. But it's only 10 seconds into the map. You just restart and come back if you weren't ready for it. No harm, foul. No foul. All right. Now we're on to difficulty control. How do you control how difficult something is over this time? This is coming into that difficulty over time thing, where a longer song is probably going to have a hard time having a difficult spike at the end because of that replay factor. But also, just in general, you want to be controlling how hard stuff is on the, let's say, axes of difficulty. Think of it as a plot. You've got perhaps one axis on this plot being the difficulty from the angles and positions. Maybe you've got the other axis on this plot being the difficulty from the irregularity in the rhythms. Got some really weird rhythm with pauses and other strange things that are hard to catch. This difficulty control means if you have these two at the same time, they're going to start multiplying off of each other. Hitting hard angles is difficult. Hitting difficult rhythms is difficult. Hitting both at the same time, you're starting to multiply these difficulties together, and it may be way more difficult than you intend. If you have something that is 9 stars of difficulty in angles and 9 stars in difficulty of rhythms, you combine the two, you might end up at 11 stars. It's not going to be another 9-star thing if you combine the two. Managing this difficulty is important. If you have these complicated rhythms, you may want to be keeping things more simple in the angles, and vice versa. If you have complicated angles, you might want to keep the positions more simple. This map isn't the best in this. There are some complicated rhythms in this section where you have pauses, odd polyrhythm, and it's going crazy with the angles. So this is difficult. This is combining both of these levels of difficulty, and honestly, this is probably the hardest part of the map. But coming into that difficulty control, the hardest part of the map is happening 30 seconds in with a 8-second intro skip and 16 seconds total of nothing. So 15 seconds in, you get to the hardest part of the map. You learn it. If you get past it, the rest is going to be more in control, and you're able to get through it. If you've got these simple rhythms, you can start doing more complicated angles, because they know they can just follow a steady quarter stream there and go through it. They know that they can swing these steady 1/3 jumps and go through it. This also comes into your rhythm choice with doubles and polyrhythm too. If you're doing these complicated angles, keeping stuff just to one hand can make your life easier. If you've got these big circles here, these circles are all happening on one hand, and you get a whole half beat before you have to swing on the other hand. Manages your difficulty a little bit more, because now you can just focus on keeping that one hand in your mind doing the crazy stuff, and the other hand is doing something simple. This stuff, really complicated angles, but hey, it's extremely slow, 90 BPM, and then these little bursts of these polyrhythms which come to easier positions as you get there. Yes, this may be fast, but the rhythms are pretty simple. It's just 1/3 jumps. And yeah, here you've got these doubles. 1/2 polyrhythm like this is usually pretty easy. It can be complicated as the BPM gets up and there's more complexity in the rhythms. Like here, this is polyrhythm between a steady 1/2 and the synths. That can be a little bit tougher. Especially with inverts, it's kind of hard to be able to read both of the things at the same time. So you're just trying to control all these things, and as the QAT modder, you're trying to think of, all right, where is the control starting to get lost? Where are things getting a little bit muddled up in what they're trying to do? Are they pushing difficulty in too many places? If so, what can be done to one of those two parts of difficulty to let the other one shine? Do they need to simplify some of these rhythms, cut down on polyrhythms so that the complicated angles can shine? Or are the rhythms really essential and they need to cut down on the angles to control the difficulty? Okay. The last thing that needs to be covered on this bigger overview section before we get into any of the specifics of optimization and anything like that, we need to think about sacrifice. Mappers, when they create something weird, are going to hold on to their ideas. Let me show you what some of these ideas looked like in the first version of the sauce. I kept this preserved so that people can see like what oddities were happening. Here, these doubles here in the uploaded version were these more comfortable scissor double things, but in the first version, these were horizontal up here. These ideas, they are very aggressive. These were very hard to hit consistently. But honestly, I was really attached to these ideas. It took me a while to want to, or to come to terms with the fact that these weren't going to work. Asking mappers to sacrifice some ideas is difficult. Generally, the best way to let them come to terms with this effectively is to preserve motions but simplify complexity. So here, these motions are very similar to the doubles. They're just in more comfortable positions. These diagonals are easier to hit than the horizontals, especially when you're doing horizontals like this one right here, isolating that note of the double. So this is a way to make the sacrifice more palatable. Thinking about, hey, what ideas do they have? I can make them easier. These were diagonal originally, or in the uploaded version, but originally they were horizontal. And honestly, horizontals are pretty tough, especially when they're traveling this much. Preserving that motion, letting it still do the vertical rising, really helped. But it was difficult to make that sacrifice. And some mappers are going to be more attached than others. You, as the QAT modder, do have a bit more influence than normal because you can let the QAT downvote stick if it's really a problem. This is something that you want to be careful about doing, but if there's something you feel very strongly about, you know is a problem, and the mapper doesn't want to let go of it, this is where you use the power as a QAT modder to enforce a little bit more for the health of ranked. Generally speaking, if they think about your ideas, they give explanations for why they don't want to change things, that should be okay. But if the ideas that they want to keep are unreasonable, this is where you exercise the power of the QAT downvote to enforce this a little bit more. So this section was much more conventional stuff. Still had these like inward scooping things, but it didn't go full upside down or anything like that. And then over here, doing full 180 turns and these very scuffed transitions, honestly. It was just completely unreasonable. I loved this hit, but it was not reasonable at all to keep in a ranked context. This is something that you could let a QAT downvote stick with if they are refusing to change it, because this is so unhealthy at the BPM for consistency in ranked. You have to think critically if it's worth it. You can't just be belligerent and let things stick because you don't like something personally. It really has to be a bigger picture thing, not about if you don't like it, but is this a good idea to rank? Is this healthy to be grinded? Will this be RNG to play? Will this be able to be learned? Is this so specific and inconsistent that it's not really a skill you're going to see anywhere else? Is this something that is way harder than the rest of the map? There's a lot of different reasons why something could be too unhealthy to keep. As a QAT modder, you have to be very careful with this responsibility, but it is not quite the nuclear option, but definitely a severe punishment that you can impose if something is that difficult, demanding, and unhealthy. I have done it a few times. It just is necessary at times. But you don't want to have that be your first resort. You would much rather prefer letting a diplomatic solution come into the works. Okay, so this covers all of the stuff when it comes to the bigger picture parts of mapping. Now we're going to go into specifics. So this is all of the bigger picture. What is the QAT modder thinking about with things being healthy, things being reasonable? What things are you calling out? What things are you trying to identify with tech maps? Now we're going to go into specifics. We are going to cover optimization. We are going to cover changing angles, changing positions, just making things better to play while keeping ideas preferably. And honestly, I think Venomous Firefly is a great example of something highly optimized and it kind of has to be optimized because of how high the BPM is. This is 264 BPM, which is really fast for anything with complex angles, and we're going to be slowing down the playback speed of this to make it more reasonable to follow. But this is where I say that tech can really mean a lot of things. In a slower map, a lot of these angles are just kind of weird, but they're not really all that shocking. But at this BPM, all of a sudden, even these slightly odd angles like these are now very demanding. Because when it gets fast, now you've got these difficult motions being way more difficult because of how fast they are. Optimization comes down to looking at these motions and seeing what will make it better. Oftentimes, optimizations you have to be very careful with because some optimizations may make it less nice to play, actually. So, for example, this hit right here, this one's kind of sketchy. I am not a big fan of this hit, especially in this context. I think it's kind of fast to be doing something like this. This note is going to be very inconsistent to hit, and this note is going to be very inconsistent to hit, though I'd say this one is easier to hit than this one just because, well, swinging horizontally true is very difficult to go into these corners with. The upper corners are also difficult, mostly the crossed over corner for the blue here. Like this hit right here would be a difficult one to reach, but this one's not nearly as bad, especially with the setup being in the far lane. You're just thinking about like where's the previous note versus where is it here, and this is why tech is slow, because you got to think about all these things. But an optimization could be, all right, this horizontal down here is really an issue, so now I do this. But if you do that, now you've got a problem here. People don't swing straight, which means that this windup could get curved into quite a bit and actually bad cut here. This is where sacrifice might need to be made, because I personally think that the best optimization for this would be to make this note not a slider, make it diagonal, and remove that dot here. Leaves you the room to not bad cut anything up here. Keeps this motion, which honestly I feel like is the main motion, and let it all be smooth. Alternatively, you could do that, remove this note here, but actually this one is still kind of bad cutty, and I wouldn't recommend it all that much. But this is the optimization. There can be multiple stages like that, where one optimization needs another part to fix to get there, especially as it gets really complicated. You start running into what I call the design space getting really small, where you just have very few options that actually work because of the setup behind it, maybe parts after it, and just all these rules that you have to keep in mind with complicated angles. But optimization in here is just thinking about where the positions are left compared to how intense do you want the swing to be. He wants this pattern where you're reaching and then coming in, then reaching and then coming in. Repeats it. He's making sure that the angles, like this could be straight up, but this optimization puts this angle to diagonal, so you're swinging just a little bit more horizontally to get ready for this one, and you're not swinging vertically down and bad cutting into that one to get there. These horizontals, honestly, I don't know if I would be using dots here for those, because you could swing dots pretty vertically, but generally if these swings are left here, you're probably going to be swinging these horizontally, which gets you ready for this hit right here. If you're doing stuff like far lane slider reaches, now you've got this very precise hit. Generally speaking, reaching into the opposite lane is very difficult to do precisely, especially when the hit is large. So to counteract that, the other hand is doing nothing during this hit. It is not a double here. Like, for example, this is an awful hit. Trying to reach this note at the same time as hitting this note is not reasonable at all. It is intentional that this is kept as a single hit, both for the emphasis of the song and just for the playability of a slider that is reaching into the far lane. Here we can see more of that same reaching far over and then coming in again. Now they're horizontals for increased emphasis. They're still optimized angles because you're going to be swinging very horizontally for these notes. And generally, as BPMs get faster, you have to be very careful with making sure that your swings are steady. And bad angles, awkward angles, start to get really sensitive to the BPM. If you are doing something with strong angle changes, the higher the BPM gets, the harder it is. That's just how the game is. The higher the BPM, the harder it is. But there's sensitivity to how difficult things get as your angles get tough. If you've just got a very standard stream, then this is going to get harder as it gets faster, but it's not going to get that much harder as it gets faster. If you were to do something more complicated, this will get harder as the BPM goes up, but it will get harder faster than the simple version because of the angles. The maintaining precision with these angles as it gets faster gets harder. And I mean, if you take this to the extreme, it's going to get even harder as the BPM goes up. And that sensitivity to the BPM is important to think about. Somebody is trying to force tech onto something that's too fast for it. That BPM sensitivity is why. It gets way too hard, way too quickly if you are trying to do things that are very heavily angled at too high of a BPM. So this is why this map is pretty damn solid, because it's managing a lot of the complexity into stuff that is reasonable for the BPM. These hits are very difficult hits, but it is slowly transitioned into. You get a whole 2 beats to get fully horizontal at this BPM, which is, I'd say, close to the minimum amount of time, but a good amount of time. And while you're there, the highest emphasis hit here is pretty connected to the song. And it's in this repeated structure. Like I talked about earlier, you've got this structure of this angle changing. You know to expect it. You know to be following it, which means that you don't have to think as much about, oh, I got to catch this weird angle that came out. No, you're just following the pattern that it gave you. And it works as a result. If these rhythms were more complicated, you'd start losing the ability to do stuff this complicated with the angles. If you, for some reason, had to catch a pause in here, that would be very difficult to catch at this speed. Because everything is steady, you have more room to be catching difficult angles because you're not thinking about the rhythms. You're just trying to follow the angles. Which is why for these very high emphasis doubles, they are large angles, but they're managed. Where was I? Here we are. So this is all being thought about, is the BPM sensitivity of these things. Is these angles are tough, but they aren't too hard as the BPM gets harder, because there's nothing truly crazy about these things. They're just wide and a little bit unusual to be seen in a map like this. It's notable, it's interesting. And as this BPM gets up a bit higher, and they get cut down to simpler doubles. You're not doing 4 wide reaches when it goes up to the faster flicks. It's managed. It's still difficult, but it's appropriate for the BPM. That's what it's doing really well here. This transition, this is kind of generally thinking about the path it takes. It's going to go up, and then you're going to be coming down at this angle through it, and that one's not great. I would probably be moving that there. But nothing's perfect. But yeah, so thinking about the sensitivity, thinking about, are these angles appropriate for the BPM? That's important to see. And this is honestly one of the big problems I see with a lot of the new blood of mapping, is they're just sort of forcing complexity onto stuff that's too fast for it. They're jumping to these really aggressive songs and mapping them as if they were slower. You cannot stick too complex of mapping onto too fast of a song because of the sensitivity. It's, if you make it twice as hard, or if you make a map twice as fast, it's not just going to be twice as difficult. If it's simple speed, maybe it'll be close to twice as difficult, comparing 180 BPM conventional speed to 240 BPM conventional speed. They're not going to be that much more difficult in terms of how hard it is to play. But if you're comparing 180 BPM tech to 240 BPM tech, and they are the same exact angles, is going to be much more than that 1.5 times more difficult. It is going to be at least 3 or 4 times more difficult. And that's a problem. It's really not healthy to take these enormous leaps in difficulty if the mapping meta is not ready for it. You don't want to be having outrageously difficult stuff compared to everything else that people are used to. Is just people aren't ready for it yet, and people are going to hurt themselves if they try to play stuff too high above their level. Honestly, that's where collapse and injuries come from, is people just playing stuff that they're not ready for. And that's why it's important to take it slow with the increasing of difficulty. Yes, we could make 17-star maps right now, but we don't know how to make them good, and people are not ready to play them, and people will get hurt as a result. So that's why we're not there. That's why we control all these things. Okay, so now this is going into this BPM sensitivity and the optimization of picking these angles so that they're appropriate. I can get into the actual logic of picking these good angles later. But the next thing I want to go over is precision. So precision is thinking about how complicated notes are to hit in terms of just getting your hands into the right positions. Hopefully I put in this key right. No, I did not. Is this correct key? Yes, there we go. Cold weather. Cold weather is a controversial one, but I personally believe it's very optimized. It's just something that people aren't used to. I don't think this thing is even all that hard. It's got a lot of really weird angles, but none of these hits are too extreme. This one is a tough one, but hey, it's to a heavy sound. It's appropriate to the matching, and it comes out of this very well. And is another example of optimization. It used to be like this, but you get more room to do this massive scoop here if they're not really tight like this. And there's not much room to scoop into that hit if they're not crossed over at the top. It's an important distinction. So the precision of these hits then is how hard is it to actually aim for one of these hits? So, for example, this crossover here, it's kind of difficult to line up both of your swings into that, right? It's not easy to precisely line up your angle into this note and this note. Same here. These aren't the easiest to line up your swings into. They're not too extreme, but they are definitely tough. And Foxy was thinking about this when he was choosing these angles for the song. The emphasis of these stuff, these are comfortable. And now, with all of these heavy hits, they are the ones that the really aggressive positions line up to. There are definitely some swings in here that I'm not a fan of, but I think as a whole it's managing the emphasis of these things pretty alright, where it's connecting the more difficult swings to the stuff that is more energetic in the song. And it is structured. This is a repeat and mirror, which means that you kind of expect it. You can learn it pretty quick because you know what these swings are and you repeat it, which means that you learn it. So, I mean, the precision of these things then is something like this. This is kind of precise to hit because it's palm up and it's kind of reaching over to the other side. It's not easy to aim all the way over there, which means that you think about the setup. This gets it horizontal. This gets your palm up. And this reaches the palm up out of it. And this one then is relaxing it and coming back out of it. And you can also see in here that the momentum is getting preserved. So you've got, this is starting to spin clockwise, 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 and it comes to this peak. And now that it's at this peak, you start spinning counterclockwise and counterclockwise and counterclockwise until it comes out of this when the hands switch. And now this is sort of playing a background role. Managing that momentum is important. It lets you follow the angles that the wrists are going to be adjusting to get to these places. And if you're staying consistent with that and thinking about the rotation of these things, you can have it transition a lot better as a result. Because if you're already adjusting clockwise to get to one swing, you can continue this momentum to get to the next one with that same clockwise transition. You just sort of slowly transition your wrist to this clockwise transition over the course of these notes, rather than having to constantly go clockwise, counterclockwise, counterclockwise, clockwise in the erratic pattern that doesn't really match the song. When you're stopping this momentum, it can be done very effectively if it's at the peak rotation of something. If you are doing a momentum change, you kind of want to think about when it's happening. So that's why at these peaks, when it's reaching really far to a hard hit, you're switching the momentum. Precision also is about the transition that's coming into it. So, I mean, you've got these very aggressive, this forehand, this backhand, this is forehand, 135-degree swings into stacks. This is something I haven't covered yet, but in general, stacks will make swings a little bit harder and windows will make swings a lot harder. And these things are sensitive to how difficult the motion is. So think of it this way. This transition is a difficult one. This transition is now more difficult. This transition is now extremely difficult. I'd say let's say I put this at, I don't know. Let's say this is a 5 out of 10 in difficulty. This now is a 5.5 or maybe 6 out of 10 in difficulty. And this is now a 9 out of 10 in difficulty. The precision of the swing, how difficult it is to precisely line yourself up through this transition to the next swing, is dependent on how heavy the swing after it is. Stacks are a little bit harder, but not really that much harder. Usually you're just thinking about vision for stacks. Windows, on the other hand, are extremely precise and very easy to be overemphasized. Honestly, if you're doing large angle changes, I would never recommend doing windows unless they are in the perfect emphasis case for them. Generally, it's not a good idea to be doing. This is also managing the momentum. So, I mean, you're palm up here, you're rotating counterclockwise, counterclockwise, counterclockwise. This right here is the peak of it, so now it's starting to rotate back out of it, and you've gotten one swing to get this clockwise counter rotation going, and then big hit. Now you're going swoosh into this hit right here with a very large clockwise motion. You already got it started with these two hits, and now you're just continuing what you had gotten started going into this 135. You also have some time to come out of it because you are just maintaining this angle for these next two hits. These are the things that you as the QAT modder are trying to look at. And this is also why modding tech is slow, because when there's something that feels off, trying to figure out why can be a lot of work, trying to identify what was the problem. Was it the hit itself? Was it the setup? Was it before the setup, managing the momentum? Was it the follow through? Was it just the swing being too big? There's a lot of reasons why it could be that. And this is also something I appreciate about this map is I believe there are no towers. There are no windows or anything like that. Stacks are the highest emphasis a swing size gets. And instead, position and angles let the emphasis. Here we've got boom, 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 bada boom. This sound right here in this is the cap. This is the cap to the thing. This is what you want people to remember. So it's going to have the highest emphasis swing. It's not a tower into this. It's just a more difficult position. That fits into the rest of the map. It doesn't make it that much more difficult to swing, but it does make it more memorable, and it makes it consistently more difficult according to the song. Here we've got this precision now where you're doing all these very aggressive reaches and transitions and whatnot. It is trying to connect to these downbeats in the middle of the song, and I think it connects well as a result. The angle changes are following that as well. And I think it works pretty well. With this section too, you're getting the benefit that these big reaches play better if you're shifting your body around. It's honestly an underrated skill, is just being able to use your body to follow stuff around to make these swings easier. This double over here, kind of aggressive. Or this stack right here is kind of aggressive. But if you shift yourself over, it's easier to reach and easier to be precise with. The patterns are sort of leading you into this with this aggressive stack into this angle, and then it leads you out of it. As this more than just friends part comes in, it gets a little bit more angled with some reaching, and it's implying just a little bit of lean for that emphasis. It works. No, I mean, the big hook of this part is this this part with the breakdown here. This goes into palm up and sort of angle transitions a lot. Palm up play is interesting. It is honestly getting pretty popular in tech now, is just playing with your palms facing up as a form of doing tech. That's fine. It can work. You have to be careful with it. Oftentimes people are very hesitant to actually lower their shoulders and elbows to get themselves into this position, which is why managing a lot of horizontal motion, getting into it is better. Oftentimes transitioning to palm up on the up is easier than transitioning to palm up on the down. There's some complicated mapping theory you could get into about why that is versus motions being against the body or with the body, motions being inward or outward, curving. It's not really too necessary because you can sort of get a feel for this just by playing and thinking about these motions. Why it would be easier to transition to the palm up on the backhand. That stuff is rising. So stuff gets more difficult as it rises. Shifts into this new structure. It's all very structured. Very intentional and crafted intentionally. And if I was QAT modding this, I would be accordingly giving my feedback. I wouldn't be telling him to restructure stuff unless I thought the structure was very problematic in the first place. A lot of this here is these transitions, like scoops like this, which on paper seem like they shouldn't work, but really, like, you got enough time to see this, learn this, play consistently, and get ready to do this swing. Now, I will say that there is some Thanos risk in some of these things, like this position is kind of Thanos. But I mean, this isn't really much better, and you get into this issue of just there's not really a good answer oftentimes. Because, I mean, down here, that also just isn't going to play well because now your hands are in very separated places, especially for the wind-up. And yeah, optimization can often just be like trying a bunch of different things and maybe even trying new rhythms to see if that helps. But yeah, it's an iterative process. You think about a lot of these things, you're trying to think about, hey, is there going to be a bad cut from the wind-up of this because people don't play this true and they're going to have to curve their swings? Hey, are these swings going to feel awkward if they're in bad positions? Is it going to feel awkward because the spacing is jumping from 4 wide to 0 wide? Hey, is this going to play bad because you're not expecting to go palm up here? Is this playing bad because it's a vision block? Is this playing bad because the rhythm is not what you're expecting it to be? There's a lot of different reasons, and this is why tech's hard, because you kind of got to think about all of them, or at least rule out stuff by playing it. And I mean, even then, start to get into issues of like, I don't like this hit here, but what are you going to do? Put it 1/2 inline behind it? Going to make it a vision block? Going to do a palm up that you're not expecting? This is probably the best answer. And actually, a sneaky option is to just make it a dot. But dots then cause reading problems. So oftentimes there's not going to be a perfect answer, and it's just about finding the best answer. This hasn't been all that focused, but it does really go into show what palm up play needs. It really needs structure. It needs expectations. It needs careful management of positions. A lot of different reasons why you would need to be careful about using palm up stuff. And like getting the player used to doing these 135-degree angles, these weird scoops, like that. It lets the player be more prepared to go and rotate the wrist up to play palm up for a bit. Or structure going into horizontals like this. And I guess to summarize everything that I was going over for this map, you want to be thinking about just the precision of how hard it is to do a transition, like with those 135 degrees. Does the momentum lead into it right? Are you prepared to do something like that? Does the map teach you that you should be ready to do something like this? It's not a sore thumb sticking out an otherwise conventional map. You want to be managing how difficult your swings are with the size of them. So, I mean, honestly, like that wouldn't be a bad idea. But stacks don't add too much. There's no towers in this map because towers are really bad when you're doing large angle changes. Honestly, players or mappers get into this habit of using large swings as emphasis tools and then combining that with techie angles at the same time and losing both of them to this combined mishmash of difficulty instead of having them go into one direction. You got patterns in here that are implying that you should be leaning a little bit or shifting your body. Like this section, leaning section, I think people have gotten more comfortable with leaning in general and are more expecting how to just tilt your body to be ready for stuff like that. There's also little subtle stuff like just matching the energy of the song. Like here, you've got these heavy hitting palm up things, and resolving that into the comfortable section. You're just like scooping your arms around and just releasing all of that energy that you've built up by going palm up here on both hands to something nice and comfy. And it lets you transition to the calm section here really well because you go from aggression to one transition, very notable transition, and now it's peaceful for this tiny reprise you have here. Okay. There's a lot to cover. We're almost at an hour already. All right, so next we want to be going into risky swings. There are just some positions that as you play the game, you will get an intuition for being kinda uncomfortable to play. This is you as the QAT modder or the mapper. What you're trying to think about is what hits are just kinda awkward to play. So I love playing this map. I don't think it's a perfect map. I think there's actually a decent number of emphasis issues in here. But I mean, it doesn't make it any less fun to play, but there's definitely some problems in here with emphasis management. So there are swings that I really don't think are good positions to be using. Namely, all the way over here. Here I'm going into big swings here. Like you're doing large transitions into very big swings. Means that you have to be precise to hit this and this at the same time. It's just, it's a lot to ask to do that 90-degree rotation or nearly 90-degree rotation. Then you've got all this inline vision blocking where you'd want to be doing that, probably that. And there's just a billion different optimization things that you could do to this thing to make it smoother. Namely, I think the biggest thing here is just large swings feel really awkward when you do large transitions into them. So, I mean, big angle changes into big swing, not good. Don't think about that. Generally, that's one of the things that I consistently call out. But these risky swings oftentimes are hits like this. Horizontal stuff is just something that I have built up over time with my intuition as being one of those things that I consistently feel like is an off hit, something that just doesn't quite feel right. And there's not really that many good ways to preserve the concept as a result. So now I start just thinking about like reducing the concept. And they might not be excited about that, but it might be the best choice. So it's really your job as playing the game to be thinking about what hits just consistently don't feel great. And inward horizontals are one of those things that just don't feel great to me. Usually they are not the best feeling motion, and often they are one of the things that I'm calling out. And you got to be really careful with transitions into there. Like this is not enough time to get into this hit right here. This hit does not get you nearly horizontal enough, and like this hit doesn't leave you enough room to get into this hit right here. You're just not expecting that kind of scoop. So the optimization come out of all of that is to soften up these things. Similar on that intuition kind of thing. I'm thinking about what I have dubbed the toddler notes as a tribute to uninstaller to mess with him refusing to stop using these. I've named outward horizontal notes anytime I'm modding as toddler notes because of his he doesn't want to let go of his toys. Honest, I was a great person. I just sometimes mess with them. So yeah, these notes I just consistently have built up my intuition as I really don't like how these play. And I communicate that with people. I say I cannot endorse these angles as being a good idea. As a backhanded outwards horizontal. I think they are consistently the reason why stuff is a problem. And that language is very specific. Backhand outwards horizontal means that this is a, well, I guess backhand outward horizontal isn't specific enough. It's a crossed over backhand outwards. I guess this is sort of the comfy side. Like, this is a comfy angle. Well, this is not a comfy angle because you have to reach over and get your shoulders and elbows way up to hit this thing. It's more okay if you're leaning, but oftentimes it is just like the source of pain. So this is where risky swings come into play. Is you just build up this intuition as you play the game, as you pay attention to the different maps as you play them. What stuff do you just consistently play and you're like, that didn't feel great. I didn't like that. For me, it's toddler notes, inward horizontals, or actually horizontal inversion. Stuff like this can be really hard, and I think this song is way too quiet to be doing stuff this complicated already. Like, yeah, it's kind of dancey and fun, but these swings here are very high emphasis, and it is a complicated pattern for something that is very visibly quiet on the spectrometer here, or spectrograph here. You got all this energy, but you've got these complicated patterns in the intro here. It's too much. Now it does get softer because this is the very first thing you do. So if you mess up something in here, yeah, you have to go back 3 seconds and you get to try it again. So that's where that difficulty and the map length and whatnot comes in. Now the thing to be thinking about here is with all of these big swings and difficult swings is people don't swing straight, which means that sometimes you get issues because people don't swing straight and then swing into other notes as a result. So, I mean, I don't know if there's too many instances in here, but this second it generally has some awkward stuff. So people aren't going to swing straight, which means that to reach this horizontal, they aren't going to go and do this massive scoop to get their hand all the way out to where this 95 number is for the left hand to be able to wind up this. They're often going to be cheesing it, swinging it less true, which is where this optimization comes into play. This is probably the better way to do it because reaching all the way out there to do this inverted thing is kind of unreasonable. Same thing here. This is just not horizontal enough to get you ready for here, so this needs to be a diagonal. And now you get into the issue of you got to optimize everything else around it. There's also plenty of vision issues in here with half-beat inlines, top row vision clutter, making it hard to see stuff like this note in this stack. Just a lot of things that could get cleaned up in this map. Now it's really fun, but yeah, it's not clean. And then hits like this are just like the energy is calming down. You don't need to be doing massive stuff like this. You don't need to be doing flicks down here like this, which are really like that is an aggressive angle. Honestly, I wonder if that is a mismap. And it's supposed to be here. No, it's not quite a mismap. But yeah, these are things that I would be calling out is some awkwardness in these motions, some angles that I'm really not a fan of that I built up my intuition over time. I know that things like wrist rolls, they need space. You can't really do really tight wrist rolls and have them feel very good. Like if you're doing that, this, as soon as you have any other complexity, is just not going to work. Yeah, like if it's one hand, then you can exaggerate and get stuff around a little bit more and it might be pretty cool. But if there's not enough space to wrist roll, then it just starts feeling really off. And there's a massive list that's just sort of intuition that I built up. It's something that you should just play, pay attention to, think about what you don't like, and build up this intuition so you can apply it to your QAT mods or your mapping. And I mean, I could make a big old list of stuff, but honestly, it's not as helpful as just people learning it themselves and building up their intuition of what does and does not work. You can sort of think through it, thinking about, hey, big swings versus large angle changes. Hey, you can think about it as what motions are tough. Like here, again, wobbly swings. People are probably going to be playing it like this with all of the horizontal reaching there, which this hit is a bad one, as you can see. Could be swinging right through that to get there. It's one reason it's a problem. Optimization could be that, but then fission. There's a lot of things that get in the way. Optimization is slow because you have to think of every single thing that could get messed up as you switch one thing to the next thing. Think of hands being very separated as being a problem at times. Vertical separation can be really awkward with stuff like this. Like that feels better, that feels better. But this feels off, this feels worse, this feels worse. Just because the hands are starting to get really far apart, which makes it hard to consistently swing those things. All right, going to move into the last map here. We're getting to the tail end of this thing. It's a lot of content. Don't blame you if you aren't watching all of it or if you're skipping around. But BPM sensitivity applies both ways. It makes it difficult to do complicated things at high BPMs, but it means you can do really wild stuff at slow BPM. 112 BPM here means you can do some just extreme angles that you should not be able to do in other places. And now the editor scale is getting really cluttered. So it's like transitions like this should be, but you can really get away with doing a scoop like this, which is just massive. People aren't usually going to be ready to go all the way down to here, except that it's 112 BPM, so it's slow enough that you can really learn it, catch it, and play through it. That BPM sensitivity. Now, I mean, yeah, wobbly swings and people cheesing stuff means they're probably going to be playing it like this, or honestly, maybe even like that, which can be a problem, but this is also something where context of the map helps, because you learn as you play this map, hey, there's some really funky angles. Get ready to get your elbows all over the place to reach down to these wild positions, like right here. This swing, if this was not 112 BPM, would be a terrible idea. But here, it's just nifty. And with all of this, you get to think about, this is an excellent place of looking at momentum, thinking about how swings that like aren't really all that wild on their own can be really interesting just because of the way they connect to the music, how gaps in the song. This pause is connected to this transition, and it makes it feel like this airy transition here, almost like you're going over a hill on a roller coaster. Or you're just scooping into it. And this kind of stuff, it's difficult to capture. And as a QAT modder, you kind of want to be trying to preserve it wherever you can. Let's go. Now, if you're doing stuff like that, you want to be careful about context, BPM sensitivity, all that kind of jazz. Now, this one's not great because the bombs are kind of getting in the way of swinging into it. And honestly, if those bombs weren't there, doing something like that could be okay if it wasn't for acid scoop. There's a couple of reasons why you could think of it, and again, you're getting into just like thinking through each part. This window here is not something I'm a fan of, but something that I would probably call out but not enforce too strictly. Generally with windows, the more you change the transition to get there, the more you have to adjust to get there, the worse of an idea it is. And also, it is way more sensitive for up windows than down windows. Down windows are generally going to be more comfortable to play through than up windows. So, yeah. You've got all these crazy transitions. It's slow enough that you can make them work, but you do have to think about people not swinging straight. Like these things, I don't know if I'd make them 3 notes personally, but again, slow. And generally, when you start crossing over, people swing less true. So you're doing these big old things. The fact that this hand is here and crossed over, it makes it harder to reach this last note of the slider. So this also goes into rhythm choices again with tech. Like if you want to push the angles, you try to keep the rhythms slower. Here, if you're going to do these really aggressive hits, it's in a very steady rhythm. It's not too hard to catch. Gigantic rolls are happening with simpler rhythms. It's just this repeated rhythm, so you hear it, you know what to expect.
Let's go.
It happens once. You can kind of expect it to happen a second time if the same exact transition in the music comes to it. So if you're then you know the next time you hear it's going to be followed with a and you can reinforce that in the mapping. These rhythm choices are honestly an extremely important part of mapping that a lot of people kind of flatten out. There are some mappers who I really do have an issue with their rhythm choices because they flatten it out to just mapping everything because they feel like it's a crime to skip a sound or whatever reasoning they have, and it detracts from the quality of the product because it does feel like nothing stands out because everything is mapped. Okay, so there's just infinite levels of optimization thoughts you can do about it. It's about building up your intuition. It's about thinking through what makes a swing good, what makes a swing not so good, what makes a motion comfortable, what makes a motion uncomfortable, what makes it possible to justify these things, and what makes it reasonable to be caught. Through all of that, optimization is a skill that you build, and a lot of it comes from your own intuition and your own experience. This is why I really strongly recommend just starting with slower BPMs and not trying to jump to high BPM stuff, because BPM sensitivity, complicated angles get way harder the faster it gets. So if you're new to tech and you jump right to 250 BPM, you're going to be making angle soup. Without enough experience, you're not getting these ideas to shine through. Stuff might just be too fast to capture. Stuff might not be structured enough to be remembered. Songs might not be connected enough with the rhythms for stuff to stand out. You might not have that experience of getting these things to connect to the song, and as a result, it doesn't really feel like you're playing the song. It just feels like you're playing angle soup. Tech is difficult. Without trying, you won't get there. And as the QAT modder, you are just trying to help them get there. Oftentimes, this is trying to identify if they have ideas and going off of that. And remember, if you don't see ideas, that is an argument to give it a downvote. A lazy map with no concepts is not high quality. And as the QAT modder, you do have the power to downvote stuff off of it being not thoughtful. If you feel like the map is just too boring, and you think that the mapper has not put enough thought into it for it to seem like a quality map, you have the ability to downvote that. I would be careful doing that. You don't want to make enemies. You don't want to cause frustration, and you certainly don't want to interfere with somebody's idea of it actually being simple as their idea for it. Because, hey, accuracy playing is a thing. People like to play just simple stuff and try to let their mastery of hitting the center of the block be the interesting thing. Power to them. People can have fun how they want to have fun. That's perfect. When it comes to tech, then, it's just about identifying these concepts and thinking, are there sections that feel really lazy? Do they flatten some rhythms out to something that's just a plain old stream when there's so much more interesting that could be going on? Are there ideas that just aren't thought through? These are the things that you start thinking about downvoting. And after you downvote, you think about going through them with these steps, checking the new versions, seeing if they've put the thought, have they got justifications? Is it reasonable for you to remove this downvote? Generally, you want to be thinking of just like if they put some thought and effort into it, that's good enough to change downvote to a neutral vote. If it's not healthy and they haven't changed the things that you really think are the problem, That's when you let the downvote stick and you sort of press their hand and let it just sit in queue if it's going to be not thought about or fixed, the things that really matter. With all of this, there is one sneaky extra part of this that is often neglected, and that is NJS and jump distance. The more complicated the angles get, the more time you need to be able to react to them, but this always depends on the player. So people need different amounts of time to be able to adjust for stuff, and some people will really struggle at following rhythms if they are on too far of an offset. It makes stuff feel floaty and off and just not so good. So you don't want to be forcing people to play too far. People are never going to use a jump distance you set for them, honestly. It's very likely that people are going to be adjusting it for their own comfort. I think of it just like putting on the shoes that fit. If you're going for a run and you're wearing the wrong kind of shoes, you're not going to perform as well. So it's just their comfort and them knowing what works for them. Now, what you are strictly enforcing is the note jump speed. The note jump speed is what's going to really stick with what the mappers are, with what the players are doing. So honestly, the jump distance doesn't matter too much. I would probably be sticking it somewhere around, personally, 20 is just a magic number. But the note jump speed, you really do want to be setting it to the lowest NJS that is reasonable to play. Higher NJS is useful for spreading out notes and keeping stuff from being clumped, but it also reduces the timing window. And the timing window is important for being able to play stuff that is complicated, because generally speaking, if you're doing a more complicated motion, it's going to take you longer to transition to that motion, and swinging off time from complicated rhythms or just stuff being difficult can happen quite a lot and be kind of a frustrating way to go through it. And it also makes it so that there's less time to actually read it, because generally people will play on a similar jump distance as long as the note jump speed is similar. So if you reduce this jump speed to 19, somebody's probably going to play on a pretty similar jump distance as if it was 21, which means that there is more time for you to actually catch things as they come at you. This is nice because, well, as the angles get more complicated, you need to be able to actually see it, adjust, and then do it. This is why the lowest NJS is nice, because the lower the NJS, the more time you have to catch these weird inconsistencies, the less it matters if you need to take a lot of time to get to a weird swing, and just generally, it's more pleasant to be playing something that is on a lower NJS. Tech, honestly, unless it's very fast, I would not be using above 19 NJS unless it really needs you to space out that density because stuff gets cluttered. I honestly can't suggest going 20 or higher in good faith. Like 21 here, that's too high. I mean, it's a product of the time. I don't think the low NJS push had started yet, but it doesn't really change the fact that now it's not the best choice to have made. So you probably, if you're the QAT modder and you're testing stuff, you probably want to just try and see what's the lowest NJS that's going to work for this. Push it down to 16 and just scoot the jump distance close. It might actually work. You can play some pretty absurdly low NJS and still have it work if it's not too dense. Now, as stacks and sliders and windows come in, it will get dense pretty quick. Honestly, the stacks, the windows, and the sliders are typically the reason why you need high NJS, because those things take up just a lot of the visual space that you're looking at. But if it's more simple, there's less sliders and windows and all that jazz, then yeah, you might actually be able to get away with something like 14 NJS and 17 jump distance. If the jump distance gets close enough, you can justify a really low jump speed, and it may actually work better than using a high jump speed and more conventional jump distance. There are a lot of ways to approach stuff. There are no right answers, which is why it's kind of a good idea to just let QAT modders do their things, because oftentimes two different people may come to two different conclusions about the same exact problem. And when there's too many conflicting answers, you start having too many cooks in the kitchen, and the mapper will get overwhelmed and not know which is the correct direction to go with. It sometimes can be a good idea to just let one person handle something as a QAT modder. If somebody else is already working on it, then just see if like the end result is something that you are happy with afterwards. If it's not, maybe they came to a different conclusion, but you know it made them happier. So it's at least in the right direction for someone. Now, it depends on how bad it is if you think you should step in afterwards, but it depends. And nobody's going to catch everything too. So I would not jump on something that is already being worked on, but it's fine to assist afterwards as long as you're not trying to pull the mapper in two different directions. But it's good to be able to catch stuff that is otherwise going to be difficult for one person to catch, especially if the song is long or complicated and there's a lot of difficult things to catch. All right, so I've rambled on for a long time now. This is a gigantic video, so I really do not blame you if you have stopped paying attention or skipped around or whatever. But I hope this was of help. If you're on the quality assurance team, I am always a resource to anyone there, and I am happy to answer questions, help out, or just, be a tool for people to use to do their job the best they can. If you're not on the quality assurance team, you feel free to DM me about stuff. I may not respond depending on the amount of time I have, but yeah. This is a complicated topic. Tech is just, we're always learning new things. We're always trying to figure out what works. And honestly, I don't know how long it's going to be until this video seems outdated, but I hope it helps for quite a while. Thank you for watching.